Fine. It is my great privilege to introduce you all to yet another amazing #Unity4J online vigil, where 35 plus amazing journalists, whistleblowers, celebrities, academics from around the world, from all different types of political ideologies, are coming together united in solidarity for Julian Assange and for WikiLeaks, for human rights and for press freedom. Thank you guys so much for being here. This is super exciting for us, and I know that it is for you as well. I just want to take a quick minute to thank the dozens of volunteers that have put this event together, our amazing tech and social media teams, and a huge thank you to WikiLeaks and to the Julian Assange legal team, who have been amazing about promoting this event as well. Thank you to everyone. Now, we're going to get straight into it because we're running just a tad late, but we have so much exciting content. We will definitely make up for it. I am here right now with the wonderful Ross Cameron. Ross is an Aussie, but we won't hold that against him. He was a Liberal member of the Australian House of Representatives from 1996 to 2004, representing Parramatta in New South Wales. But he is more well known now as the host of The Outsiders on Sky News Network in Australia. Ross, say hi.
Well, that was just a perfect intro. That's like 10 out of 10.
I'm not so sure about that, but I'm just so pleased to have you with us. Ross was with us in our last stream, guys, and he was so amazing. If you haven't seen that clip, you should go back and have a look at it. We got incredible feedback from everybody about him. So I begged him to come and be with us again today and to open the event with me. So thank you so much, Ross, for coming and for doing that.
Well, I'm very flattered to open the batting. It's certainly an illustrious crew that you have assembled. I must say, one of the things that I enjoy, I mean, the defence of Julian Assange is not something I associate with a great deal of pleasure. But I find the people who are drawn to Julian and to WikiLeaks are just great company. You know, they're interesting, diverse, rational, open-minded, curious people. So even here in Australia, I mean, if you go through Greg Barnes, who was with us last time, I'm not sure if he's I mean, he and I politically are very different. Yet we are just like brothers in arms when it comes to Julian Assange. I mean, Caitlin Johnson, another, like you, I regard a very distinctive voice in independent journalism in Australia. She would describe herself, I think, as an anarcho-socialist. I would be more of a, unreconstructed reactionary conservative. Yet I find the thesis of WikiLeaks irresistible.
That's such a remarkable observation, and it's so true. And it's something that's really important to me because I feel like conventional modern day politics has been very compartmentalized, and it's very much divide and conquer everywhere you see, especially since 2016 election. And I feel that events like this, we're really overcoming that divide, and we're showing people, hey, it's actually okay to talk to people who don't necessarily agree with everything you say or everything you think, and to find those single issues that you can unite on and make real progress for humanity on. And I think it's such an obvious one that we need to get Julian out of that embassy. We know that it is not okay for a publisher and a journalist to be on effectively solitary confinement for extended periods of time with no relief in sight. It is not okay for someone to have no access to medical care. It is not okay for someone to have no access to basic freedom of communication and expression, and to be able to communicate with their families, to be able to see their children for 8 years at a time. These things are not okay whether you're a conservative or a anarcho-socialist or an environmentalist or a libertarian. I consider myself a humanitarian libertarian. I'm very much a child of the left, but also very attracted to libertarian ideals. So really we're just showing, I think, that we can be adults, that we can put aside, these stringent beliefs that we have as individuals to come together on the beliefs that we share. As I want to say the 99%, because I feel like that's what it is. The 99% is nearly everybody on the planet, not just one political ideology or another one. So for me, that's definitely the highlight of this event. But getting back to you, Ross, something I really wanted to ask you. You have a major mainstream platform, and it would be so easy for you to turn a blind eye to Julian's plight because, hey, it might actually have some career benefits to go along with the status quo, or to, you know, serve the corporate overlords as so many journalists do. I want to know, what is it that made you take a stand for Julian and WikiLeaks, whether or not it's been a popular stand at certain points in history, and whether or not it's been a profitable one, given the scale of the opposition to him? Why is it that you stand up for him and that you use a mass media platform to do it?
Well, it's, you know, it's cable TV. I'm not sure how my critics constantly say that nobody watches my show. So, you know, people shouldn't worry. But no, it's, for me, it comes down to the quality of the argument. And when Julian was asked by a journalist, you know, in an interview I watched at one stage, why he started WikiLeaks. And I was quite intrigued by his response because it was very far from any sort of messianic thing, but it was just saying that each of us comes from a particular culture, in his case, Australia, with a set of natural gifts and aptitudes, with a certain amount of knowledge and capital resources. And he said that he felt, for him, it was a natural expression of his life and of his philosophy. And I say, I have brought a couple of props along, if that's okay, Susie, since I thought you're going to be stuck with me for nearly an hour, right? You might run out of things to ask me. So I'm going to show you a couple of little props. Okay, right here, this is my buddy Marcus Aurelius. Okay, he was the Emperor of Rome from 161 AD to about 180. This is his book, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus is a significant figure in Stoic philosophy. And he has this beautiful sense of time, as the Stoics did, that we're on this earth but once. And this was a point that Julian made in response to the journalist. He said, we're only here once. We ought to, you know, do what we can with the moment that we have. And at the risk of eccentricity, I'm going to read you just one paragraph from the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. So he says, if then when you finally come close to your exit, you've left all else behind and value only your directing mind and the divinity within you, if your fear is not that you will cease to live, but that you never started a life in accordance with nature, then you will be a man worthy of the universe that gave you birth. You will no longer be a stranger in your own country, no longer meet the day's events as if bemused by the unexpected. And I think about Julian, who is a kind of stranger in his own country. And frankly, I am embarrassed. I'm here partly in the confessional. I'm embarrassed by the way Australia treats one of its citizens. I'm embarrassed by how low value an Australian passport is as a document, in view of the fact that the Australian government, as I understand it, subject to correction from Julian's lawyers, has still declined to issue him with a current passport. But going to the philosophy, I just find whatever you think about Julian as a personality, I find his argument compelling. In fact, I find it irresistible. And I think, well, if you don't have a better argument, you're kind of duty bound to submit to the best one available. So that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, he's definitely set the benchmark for fearless journalism. And I feel very much that he has created space by being as supposedly radical as it is to publish the truth. Strange enough that as it is that we could call that radical to publish the truth. He's actually created a space for hundreds of thousands of particularly independent journalists like me around the world who are able to not just follow in their footsteps, but do it a little bit more safely, because Julian and WikiLeaks have been taking an immense amount of heat, an immense amount of deep state resources that are targeting them. And that provides all of us in independent media sphere with a bit of safety and a bit of room to move that we otherwise might not have, and certainly might not have if Julian and WikiLeaks were actually taken down. Which is why one of the arguments that I make is that by protecting Julian, we really are protecting ourselves. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this was one of the points that Kim.com made on his appearance last time. And you know, shout out to Kim.com, who is being done over by the deep state right now. And what you find in this sort of seesawing battle between the state and the citizen, between the insiders and what I call the outsiders, you will find the deep state where they will especially attack like a sort of a swarm of hornets is where they find an example of outstanding competence. And so what you find in both Julian and Kim.com is two blokes who became the absolute masters of their art. And that is deeply threatening to the sort of bloated, bureaucratic, blunt, dumb state. And so seeing an example of excellence, of commitment to mastery, there is this impulse among the bureaucrats to destroy that thing, partly because, as you say, it provides inspiration to so many others.
Absolutely. Now, in the past, we have seen Jeremy Corbyn, I think it was 2010, 2011, tweeting on the behalf of Julian, or in support of Julian. We have seen recently some kind of movement from the Australian government, and at least I believe the High Commissioner did actually show up and finally visit the embassy, isn't that correct? Which was a long time coming, to say the least. What do you think it's going to take for us to see more people in power beginning to support Julian in his plight?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we want to do the political analysis, look at where the pieces are on the chessboard. Others may have a better view than me, but my off-the-cuff reading of it is I see that we had a couple of Tories today in the UK, or yesterday. UK official calls for the end of Assange impasse. I see. No, that wasn't today. That was the end of last month. British Foreign Office Minister called Tuesday for an end to the impasse surrounding WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. Patrick McLaughlin asked, how long is the government going to put up with it? Now, the Tories have behaved absolutely appallingly. The Tories have disgraced themselves and the British common law. The truth is that the Crown Prosecutor Service in London is up to its eyeballs, is a lead instigator in the persecution and torture of Julian Assange. And, you know, as discussed last time, the collusion between the Crown Prosecutor Service of the UK and Marion Nye, the equivalent Crown Prosecutor in Sweden, to ensure that Julian was held under intense intimidation, including threats of assassination from most senior figures in the United States government for 6 years without interview, not just without charge, but without interview. So this woman, Marion Nye, had one job, You know, she only had one investigation she was in charge of, and she was so busy she could not interview the one person of interest for 6 years. And, you know, these people wonder why we feel disgust and contempt for, you know, people like Theresa May and Boris Johnson, who hold themselves out as British, who are the inheritors of a common law tradition going back to the Magna Carta, which still holds today, that it is unlawful in Britain, as it has been for 1,000 years, to detain a man without charge. And these guys, they're just thugs, you know, they are not really British in any traditional sense. I mean, they are total betrayers of this tradition. And what you see, the bigger question which you touch on, is that it's a ceding of authority by citizens to an arbitrary state. And, you know, as you mentioned, I was a member of the House of Representatives in Australia. There is a tradition when we elect a new speaker that the speaker is dragged to the chair by two of his colleagues or her colleagues. And that tradition grows out of the fact that 9 speakers in the House of Commons were executed by the King. 9. But each of them stood up in a way that Theresa May and regrettably Boris Johnson and regrettably the Australian High Commissioner to London, former Senator George Brandis, have not stood up. Our boys and girls have folded, you know, like a crumpled suit. And they won't stand up for the citizen. Now, I say, you know, if I'm going to bore you with my thesis, you know, I think what we're seeing, Susie, is a situation where the amount of data in the world was limited by technology, was limited by the media available. So when the first fleet arrived in Australia in 1788, it took 3 months to send a message back to the Home Secretary and another 3 months for him to respond to it. So it took 6 months by analogue communication on ships for 2 people to communicate with each other. And that's just 1788. If you go today to the speed at which we create data, where so much of our lives have moved from the analogue to the digital sphere, where every keystroke leaves a trace, what we have seen is that there has been a massive war for control of the data. And I think Julian Assange is just saying that in the same way democracies operate on the principle of the sovereignty of the citizen, you know, data must flow in the same way. And that has been upended. It's been turned on its head. And the big state has realised that, has formed this ambition to own and control our data. And as a consequence, a range of agencies have betrayed their fundamental trust to citizens, and they have gone into business with each other against citizens, in which I include the mainstream media, much of the NGO sector, almost all of the university sector, the government departments, and the worst culprits of all, the intelligence services. So we're up against a pretty big, you know, Eisenhower called it the military-industrial complex. It's a big bully to take on. It's the biggest bully in the playground, and I just think Julian Assange is just a case study in how a group of collusive thugs deal with one person in the playground who says, I'm not going to play ball.
And yet they still haven't managed to get rid of him. And that is actually quite heartening. And Julian said that people who are truly principled, who are truly moral and ethical, don't usually live long. And that's unfortunately quite true throughout history. And yet Julian has, and WikiLeaks more broadly, have been able to protect themselves in certain ways that other people throughout history wouldn't have been able to, whether it's through use of encryption and protection of information, or in their communications in terms of how they were able to get Snowden to Russia, for example. Feats like this simply weren't possible previously. And so there have been some big wins, and Julian is still with us, thank God. But more broadly, my question about the politicians, why are they not yet supporting him? I'm thinking back to the Free Mandela movement. I'm thinking about the process by which we went from Mandela as a terrorist to we are having international Live Aid style concerts to free Mandela, and hundreds of thousands of people are marching in however many countries, and politicians are leaping to have photo opportunities with Mandela, and now he's winning a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm interested in that transition because I see very clearly that this is the transition for Julian. I think he's gone from the 2010 Pentagon manhunt, every paper in the world calling him a rapist, despicably calling him a rapist, falsely calling him a rapist, to now where we've seen in the last few months the seeds of people are actually starting to march. There are vigils on the ground in, I think we did 10 or 12 cities, June 19th around the world. This, to me, this is the seeds of a mass movement that can ultimately achieve Julian's emancipation, but more importantly, ultimately bring him to his due in the public consciousness and in the historical record. And I think that many of these politicians who were perfectly happy to see intelligence agency types, threatening to drone him to death or threatening to kill him, one day these will be the very same people who want to have their photo opportunity with Julian, who's won the Nobel Peace Prize and becomes this generation's Nelson Mandela. That's kind of where I was getting at with that.
Sure. Well, look, I love your prophetic vision. That is my hope and prayer, and I think it's plausible. I'm not in this as a purely some sort of flagellation exercise. I think there is a decent chance, if our boy can hang on for long enough, that the walls of Jericho will eventually collapse. And it could happen quite quickly. And indeed, I think we're starting to see, some of these narratives. If you look at, for example, what I regarded as just the complete bull story of the so-called Skripal poisoning of, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, allegedly poisoned by a lethal chemical, industrial grade nerve agent, quote, of a type made by Russia. The lies that are having to now be told to keep this jalopy on wheels are just so big that ordinary people are just looking at him and saying, excuse me, do you really expect you? How dumb do you think we are? And I think we're seeing that in the United States, I suspect, is where the thing collapses. I mean, we have to admit, if you take, for example, you and I may well be on different sides of the argument, or different sides of the ballot box, if we were voting in the next election for Donald Trump. I'm not sure. I don't presume to know how you would vote. But I, in 2016, would have voted for Trump as many times as I could. Mainly because I felt he was willing to challenge, what I regard as the war machine. I mean, the Clinton-Obama era. And frankly, I have to admit, as a conservative who supported George W. Bush, who voted in favour of the invasion of Iraq as a member of parliament, I've just got to admit that these wars have turned out to be hopelessly counterproductive, that in many cases their logic is incoherent, when you wind up in situations, for example, where you've got Russia excluded from NATO, but Turkey a member of NATO. The problem is you create these agencies. You've got, if you have a look at the NATO building, the latest one they've just built, I mean, it's like the Taj Mahal. I mean, it is the most magnificent piece of, you know, commercial industrial architecture. The question is, what is its purpose? And this quiet voice of peace just does not get a Guernsey. In Australia, you got Fairfax Media. I was a columnist for Fairfax Media and indeed wrote a beautiful article in defence of Julian Assange in 2011 in Fairfax Media. But the truth is, today, what is meant to be the progressive left, they're just a bunch of warmongers. There's no bomb, you know, they don't like. Everyone hated Donald Trump on the progressive left, and still, until he dropped 50 bombs on Syria, then suddenly he's a top bloke. I mean, really, the idea, the most persuasive idea, I think, of the Assange thesis is that transparency is actually in our interests. You know, Marcus Aurelius thanks his father in the opening to the meditation for teaching him to have few secrets. Secrecy is overrated. Nearly always the benefit is found in transparency rather than in secrecy. And I just find the agencies, if we ask ourselves the question, Susie, I mean, Assange is being belted around because he published, leaked, or some argue hacked material. Can I just say, these agencies have got no capacity to keep their data secure, Susie. If we go through the list, if we just look at the record, what we find is that even with the best will in the world, even if you have good people running these agencies who wish governments to submit to their constitutions and who still believe that citizens have a role to play in democracy, which is a minority. But let's say, you know, you've got the good guys running the joint. What you find is that it is simply not possible to secure the citizens' data. So if we ask the DNC, all of that data was not hacked. It was obviously leaked. In my judgment, it was leaked by Seth Rich because he was a guy of natural, equitable instincts who saw one candidate, Bernie Sanders, being systematically destroyed by the DNC, and another, Hillary Clinton, being, you know, unfairly promoted. And he felt the disgust, which would be natural to any normal person who was not living in a bubble inside the machine of political apparatchiks. And so he said he took one of the few measures that were available to him, which was to publish the data. We see with Bradley / Chelsea Manning a similar kind of impulse, an intelligence agent looking at the data, shocked by civilian casualties, by the logic behind much of the military operation. Now, whether we agree with Bradley Manning or disagree with the decisions he took, we have to acknowledge that what he did could happen, you know, it did happen, and it will happen again. Now, then if we go, for example, to the US Congress and the Arwan brothers and their Pakistani mates, we find Debbie Wasserman Schultz invites a couple of guys from Pakistan in, pays them $100,000 initially, millions over time, to take control of the private emails of 40 members of Congress. And these guys for, I believe, a commercial motive, just systematically selling the data. So we know, you know, that some joker in Pakistani intelligence in Lahore is sitting there every day reading the emails of 40 members of the US Congress because they cannot secure their data.
Do you remember the OEM breach?
OPM breach, the Office of Personnel Management breach, I believe 2015, was the internal files and documents of every American, not just military service personnel, but any one who worked for the federal government in any capacity, who had at any time received a clearance of any level for any agency. All of those files leaked. And that had the most intimate, details and personal history of not even just those people, but of their family, their friends, their past lovers, you name it, their kids. It was all in there, and that leaked. I mean, CIA Vault 7, classic example. Billions of dollars of cyber weapons leaked. So I think you're completely correct. I'm just intrigued. I'm just going to ask you one thing, because it just tracks back to what you were saying about the Iraq War and having actually voted for it, believing at the time that it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
If we had WikiLeaks in 2001, theoretically, if you had access to material like the Collateral Murder video leaked by Chelsea Manning, would that have changed your vote if you understood that that was the reality of what would be perpetuated or perpetrated even in Iraq? And more broadly, would it have changed your colleagues' votes, do you think, if all of them had access to it as well?
Yeah, well, look, that's an interesting question. I would say Iraq. I still find myself, torn by Iraq insofar as Saddam Hussein was certainly maintaining to the world that he had a nuclear capability. Hussein threatened to drop nuclear weapons on his own soldiers if they retreated. Uday and Qusay Hussein I regard as about the lowest form of human life that can still be called human. But we also have to accept what has been demonstrated is that we great white Western powers are pretty good at regime change, but we're absolutely shit at building a durable peace on the other side of regime change. And I think, likewise, if we had have known that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that would have been, we're acting as an American ally. Colin Powell walks in before the UN and says, these guys have got nuclear weapons and they're going to get more. I think, yes, certainly, I think what we have now seen, the second Iraq invasion, was obviously a catastrophic blunder. We discovered that we could not build a peace on the other side of it. I say that the engagement in Iraq, which has cost in Syria, it's cost 500,000 lives, has achieved nothing, absolutely nothing, except 20 million displaced people who have totally rewritten the demography of Europe. And I just say, people, I think, are beginning to realise, and now you have, I think, MI6, Theresa May, just desperately begging for a war with Russia. Significant figures in the US, between the FBI, the CIA, the Pentagon, the Department. There's significant people in the US who actually believe that a war with Russia would be in the interest of the human race. And it's just so. I think ordinary people are looking at it and saying, you guys have lost your marbles. I think that there is a gradual realisation taking place. Joseph Stalin said that a lie is always more influential than the truth. Lenin said that anything done in the name of the revolution is moral. But over time, the question is over time. I said to a cabinet minister in the Australian government that this horse has bolted. You guys can't keep your information secure and you're just punishing the messenger in relation to Julian Assange. And why don't you just accept the fact that the horse has bolted and start figuring out how we can repair the risks to private data instead of attacking the bloke who brought the issue to your attention. He said to me, a cabinet minister in the Australian government, the Catholic Church managed to suppress Galileo for 100 years. I'm sure we can deal with Julian Assange. So I just say, no, I'm not prepared to accept that. I believe that in the end, the truth is going to win. It will be in the interim, we will waste a great deal of money. A lot of people will get killed. But I think that in the end, even though the lie initially is influential, over time, the truth will prevail.
You just made a really interesting point there about data protection, because if there's anyone in this world who knows about data protection, it's Julian. And you would think that, particularly the US, as we've just discussed, in the context of the OPM breach and everything else, would have leapt at the opportunity to actually have Julian assist them in terms of data protection. And we've recently heard talk about there having been a temporary immunity deal on the table if he was in fact able to or willing to work with them, and that was nixed by Comey, I believe. And was it Senator Mark Warner?
Yes. So we had Mark Warner from Virginia, son of a senator, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And I regard him as generally speaking, as a sellout. He was engaged it was part of a discussion about some form of immunity safe passage deal, in which Julian, as you correctly observe, said as part of the deal, I will show you where some of the most flagrant and obvious defects are in your firewalls and your data security apparatus as part of this deal. And James Comey then intervened and said, cease all communication with Julian Assange. Now, James Comey is a swamp creature. You know, he's fully habituated to the swamp. And, you know, I think my secret hope, I mean, London is going to receive a visit from Donald Trump on Thursday next week. He's going to pass pretty close by to our boy, Julian. Donald Trump reckons he is the world's greatest deal maker. May be true. It's possible. It may be correct. I think there is a moment here. There is an opportunity here. And I would, as one of Donald Trump's rusted on, irrationally, perhaps loyal, believer in the outsiders, I want to appeal to Donald Trump. I want to say to Donald Trump, mate, this is your opportunity to show the world that you are the greatest deal maker. I think there's a deal to be done here. And if you guys, if the military-industrial complex, if the Prime Minister of Australia actually wants to murder Julian Assange, if that is the objective of these guys, is to wrap a noose around his neck, stand him on a block of ice and watch it melt in the Ecuadorian embassy, then they ought to have the guts to call it what it is. And they ought to not dance around this. If they're trying to kill the bloke, you know, as Hillary Clinton said, can't we just drone this guy? If that is the objective, then they ought to be upfront about it. Otherwise, I just invite Donald Trump, now that he is gaining political momentum, to accept the fact that Julian did play a significant role in his election. And I say that, let's remember that Julian played a significant role in taking the gloss off the George W. Bush administration on exactly the same principle. So no one has a better claim to non-partisanship than Julian Assange. Indeed, the Australian media gave him a Walkley Award, the highest award available, when he was disclosing the secrets of the Bush administration, whereas now they have dropped him like a sack of potatoes because they're not interested in transparency. They're interested in their private political obsessions. And I think, well, here we go. This is a Trump in the UK. I think we need to we all need to direct energy on the Trump administration and say, take this moment. You're a great deal maker. Let's do a deal.
That's a great point. I think from my perspective, what I would say to Donald Trump is Obama said hope and change, came in and didn't do a single damn thing that he had promised that he would do, in which had gotten him elected. Donald Trump told us, make America great again, no more expansionism around the world, no more wars, we're going to rein it in finally. And I think that was a huge reason that he got the popular support that he did. And he also, the whole deep state narrative, I think how he handles this is going to determine whether he is seen as being someone who did make good on those promises and stand up to against the deep state, or whether he is seen to be a puppet being run by the deep state. And ultimately it's the deep state. It's the deep state that want Julian dead.
Yeah, I think you're right. And Kevin Rudd, who was a pretty daft bloke, high IQ, but he said the greatest moral challenge facing our generation was climate change. I actually believe that, Julian Assange is a question of which will be resolved by history. And you want to be on the right side of history. I honestly, I don't care what people think about Julian individually. I've never met the bloke. I've never spoken to him. But I can't resist his argument. There's absolutely no question in my mind that he's the voice of citizens. And this is going to be a test for Donald Trump. I think if he could bring peace to the Korean Peninsula, if he could get out of Syria and allow a sovereign government to begin to, enjoy its most basic privileges and look after its citizens instead of dropping bombs on them. But if he can do a deal, the question of data is unresolved. The question of what we do when data is breached, whether it is hacked, whether it is leaked by someone who is disgruntled or someone with a commercial motive, whether it's left on a USB stick in a McDonald's restaurant, the question of what happens to data has got to be resolved because it's absolutely clear that the state is not competent to keep it secure. Julian Assange is saying, well, the safest and fairest thing to do with it is to accurately publish. And I just believe whether you are a liberal, a conservative, an anarcho-socialist, a humanitarian, libertarian, whatever label you want to describe yourself, it is absolutely in our interest as citizens that Julian Assange survives and prevails.
I can't think of a better note to end on than that one. I completely agree with you. It is of vital importance to humanity and to human progress that Julian Assange prevails. Thank you so much for that wonderful quote to end on, Ross. Is there anything else that you would like to say to everyone?
Oh, look, this great Australian boxer, Tony Mundine, who says, love yous all, I love yous all.
Group hug. Sorry that I'm so far away, or I would love to do it in person, but thank you so much for being here with us, Ross. It means a lot to us, and you can expect I'll be knocking on your door again next month.
Okay, well, I will snap heels and present myself.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was Ross Cameron from Sky News Australia, and